Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode in my mystery series, where today we're going to be talking about a very unusual Jane Doe case. I say unusual because we're not talking about this case today in an effort to get Jane Doe identified. I think we'll all agree that it's quite obvious that is not what this woman wanted. As far as the public are aware, this Jane Doe intended to die where she did, how she did, unidentified. I will of course be telling you about the circumstances surrounding her death and what we know of her as is, but I do think it's maybe interesting to entice a bit of conversation around the ethics surrounding Doe identification. To what point do we have a duty to find the identities of these people? How ethical is genetic testing to find these identities? I don't know the answer to this, but I thought it could entice some interesting conversations in the comments. Today I'm going to be sharing the story of Annandale Jane Doe, or Christmas Tree Lady. You'll find her referred to as both across the internet. It was the 18th of December 1996 in Annandale, Fairfax County, Virginia, when Jane Doe was discovered just inside Pleasant Valley Memorial Park, a small cemetery on Route 236. As of the 2010 census, Annandale had a population of just over 41,000 people, but in the 90s this was over 50,000. That's a lot of people who may have known who our Jane Doe was and why she did what she did. But of course that is operating under the assumption that Jane Doe was from the area. She may not have been. But surely there was a reason why she decided to die in the place that she did, specifically in that cemetery. On the outskirts of Washington DC, Annandale provides easy access to a number of parks and woodland areas, both within the town and a short journey outside. Jane Doe chose to die there and surely knew that she'd be found within a number of hours. Everything was thought through. Why did she not choose to wander out further and end her life somewhere where she might not have been found, at least not for a significant amount of time? Because it was clear she wished to remain unidentified. Less than a 2-hour drive away from where she was found, you'll find yourself in the expansive Shenandoah National Park. These are all questions to which we don't have the answer, but it does seem to me that the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park was intentionally chosen as the place to end her life. It was shortly after 9 a.m. on the 18th of December 1996 when two cemetery workers came across her body. At first they assumed that she was just asleep, but they quickly realised that was not the case. Jane Doe was found very close to the section of the cemetery where babies were buried, although she wasn't found particularly close to any grave. This section of the cemetery is actually called Babyland, and I've seen lots of speculation online that maybe she was the mother of one of the babies buried there, perhaps an unmarked grave, perhaps stillborn, perhaps she didn't have the means to care for a child and abandoned it, hence why she chose this spot to end her own life. It's estimated that Jane Doe was anywhere between 50 and 70, so the likelihood is if this is the case, if one of these babies was hers, she would have been pregnant maybe 3 to 5 decades earlier, although that is pure speculation of course. It is worth noting though that Doe Network states that most of the headstones near to where she was found were fairly recent though. And also, some people speculate that she was a drifter or a transient. If she was somebody who didn't know the area well, she probably would have had no idea this cemetery existed. It's very small, hidden away. You only really go there if somebody you love is buried there. According to Doe Network, Jane Doe was found lying on a clear plastic sheet on the ground. The whole scene was incredibly strange and I'm sure very startling for the people who came across her. There was an 8-inch tall Christmas tree next to her body, which she had gone to the effort of decorating with gold balls and red ribbons. Remember, this was a week before Christmas. There was a portable cassette player with headphones which were on her ears, and Jane Doe had clearly listened to the tape in the player as she died, which just so happened to be a recording of two comedians called Mel Brooks and Carl Rayner doing their 2,000-year-old man routine. This was a comedy sketch created by the two men in the 50s, before first being publicly performed in the 1960s, in which Brooks plays, you guessed it, a 2,000-year-old man. The sketch was semi-improvised, with Rayner asking Brooks questions, who would come up with answers on the spot in a Jewish American accent. It kind of covered everything from marriage to children to transportation. but Brooks's fantastic historical knowledge always brought an extra layer to the performance, which is why it was so popular. And the nature of the sketch meant that each time it was performed, it would go slightly differently. I must say, I did watch a clip on YouTube of this sketch and I didn't find it particularly funny, but Jane Doe clearly enjoyed it. So much so that she ensured it was the final thing she heard on this earth. Or maybe she meant to use the tapes to send a message, maybe that she'd been on the earth for too long. As stated in a December 2000 article found on WashingtonPost.com by Tom Jackman, police detectives Richard Perez and Mike Headley turned up at the scene 40 minutes after the cemetery workers contacted them, and they found Jane Doe's body still warm despite the cold December weather, so she clearly hadn't been dead for too long. They checked her pockets for identification, but of course found none, instead finding 2 envelopes, one addressed to the cemetery and one to the coroner. There were 2 crisp $50 notes, one in each envelope, and the same typed note in each, reading, "Deceased by own hand, prefer no autopsy. Please order cremation with funds provided. Thank you, Jane Doe." An NBC News article also includes an extra sentence in this note, reading Valium and alcohol plus alcohol, perhaps referring to how she decided to end her life. It was very clear that this woman had intended to die, and a plastic bag was also found over her head, secured with masking tape around the neck to ensure it was airtight. Close by her was her backpack, which contained the roll of masking tape that she'd clearly used to seal the bag, and 2 more comedy cassettes as well. These ones featuring Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and You Might Be a Redneck by Jeff Foxworthy. Investigators also found 2 empty juice bottles, either in the backpack or just near the body, depending on which source you want to believe. One of the bottles was labelled as a Mango Mania flavour from a brand called Mystic, which from what I can gather was a pretty popular brand in the 90s in the USA, and the other bottle was a peach flavoured juice from the brand Loser, a brand which investigators said they'd never seen before. An article posted on NBC in September 2007 stated that investigators were still then wanting to know where that brand was sold. But of course, that would have been before the wonders of the internet and search engines as we know them today. A quick Google showed me that Loser is indeed a juice brand that now seems to be owned by PepsiCo. The PepsiCo website states, Loser fruit juices have been made in Belgium since 1947. To this day, Loser has a strong bond with Borgloon, where it's been bottled since 1958. Here in the UK, you can buy it on Amazon or on the BelgianBeerCompany.com, and I used my very helpful VPN to jump over to the USA and confirm that you can also buy it on Amazon over there, although it is pricey. Of course though, our Jane Doe was found in 1996. It wasn't as easy as just placing an Amazon order, and it would have been significantly harder to get hold of Loser in the USA back then. So much so that investigators are still saying in 2007 that they'd never heard of the brand. Could it be possible that Jane Doe was Belgian or at least European? As well as the 2 juice bottles, an empty flask was also found, which was later found to have contained brandy. And this did match up with her blood alcohol level, which was found to be at 0.14. For context, in the USA, the blood alcohol limit for driving is 0.08, so Jane Doe was not far off double this. Testing also showed Valium in her system. As per Jane Doe's wishes, a full autopsy was not carried out, but NamUs does state that an external examination was conducted by a pathologist, and clearly they at least took her bloods and ran some toxicology testing. A newspaper article from the Washington Post dated Tuesday, December 24th, 1996, states that the police have called the death an apparent suicide, but are waiting for an autopsy to determine the cause of death. But obviously an autopsy was never carried out. Also found is a Minnie Mouse bum bag or fanny pack if you're American. This bum bag seems to have been child size, is apparently very well worn and had been mended many times with masking tape and safety pins. Was this an item of significance to Jane or just something that she happened to own? Finally, there was a typewritten poem found along her belongings, which investigators believe was written by Jane Doe herself, as they've been unable to determine any other author. The note, or perhaps I should say poem, reads, "Now I lay me down to sleep, soon to drift to the eternal deep, and though I die and shall not wake, sleep sweeter will be than this life I forsake." Jane Doe clearly thought everything through carefully before going ahead with ending her own life. She chose her resting spot, maybe purposefully in a place that she knew she would be discovered not long after her death, or maybe because that spot had significance to her. She laid down a plastic sheet, she sat down with a flask of brandy. Maybe brandy was her favourite drink, or maybe she just thought it would numb the thoughts. Maybe she was an alcoholic in life. The juice again may simply have been a favourite, but I've seen lots of speculation online that she may have crushed the Valium and put it in the juice to make it easier to swallow, and I must say that when I first heard this case, I thought along those lines too. Jane Doe came prepared with her favourite comedy sketches on tape so she could die laughing. And when she was ready and had consumed all she needed to, she pulled the plastic bag and tape out of her bag and suffocated herself to ensure there was no chances of survival if the substances didn't do their job. Jane Doe went to great lengths to ensure that she wouldn't be identified. There were no receipts in her pockets, obviously no ID, no personal belongings that really helped investigators on their way. This woman was determined to be unidentified. And to me, the most interesting thing about the still lack of identification in this case is the fact that Jane Doe had only been dead for a few hours when she was discovered. Her face was still completely recognisable, and yet no one's ever come forward saying they know this woman. Her estimated age range is between 50 and 70, like I said. Personally, I'll place her smack bang in the middle of that, around 60 years old. She was a white female, short at just 5 foot and 157 pounds, although other sources do list her as between 5'4" and 5'7". She was described as healthy. She had this distinctive red hair, almost a copper colour, and curly. Her eye colour was unknown, as asphyxiation affects the eyes significantly. She had an 8-inch long scar on her abdomen, probably from a C-section, but bear with me, we'll spin back round to that in just a second, and her fingernails were painted red. There was also a red, black and white scarf found in her belongings, and in terms of clothing, she was wearing a lot of layers. It was December. She had on a teal all-weather Eddie Bauer hoodie jacket in size medium, a navy blue Classiques Intenieur knit sweater in size large, an extra large red Classiques Intenieur sweater, a red Classiques Intenieur sleeveless silk shirt in petite large, a pair of navy blue Classiques Intenieur knit wool pants in size large, knee-high stockings, a white support bra, white Fruit of the Loom underpants in US size 6, so UK 10, and black loafers in a size 7. She wore a lot of the same brand, this Classiques Intenieur, which from what I can gather is a now defunct clothing brand that last existed around 2018, and it was actually one of Nordstrom's own clothing lines. It was definitely on the higher end of the price range, with dresses towards the sort of $200 mark, and pretty much everything over $100, and it seems to me to be very workwear focused, sort of office chic kind of clothing. The Doe Network and a lot of other sources make a specific point of saying that the clothing may have come from an upscale store such as Saks Fifth Avenue, which is a higher end department store you can find all across the USA. But that is a direct competitor with Nordstrom, and the brand was a Nordstrom only clothing line as far as I can gather. Please do correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm just going off of information I found shortly before the brand was discontinued. There is a chance in the 90s this brand may have been sold at Saks, but from what I can find it was sold at Nordstrom. I suppose it doesn't really matter exactly where Jane Doe bought the clothing. The more important point is that it seems that this was a woman with money. Not many people can afford to spend over $100 on just a shirt, but this Jane Doe could buy entire outfits of this high-end brand. In terms of other items on her body, she had 2 clip-on earrings, a small gold woman's Guess watch with a mesh band, which is another high-end brand, a 14-carat gold ring with 4 jade stones. It doesn't specify what finger this was found on, so whilst it does sound like an engagement ring, we can't be sure. And she also had a metal bead chain with a medic alert reading no code, no DNR, no penicillin. Jane Doe wore bifocal glasses with translucent frames, and the bag containing her belonging is described as a green knapsack, although in photos it does strike me as more of a grey, but it's from a brand called Ray or REI. Coming back around to the scar on her abdomen that I mentioned not too long ago, a lot of people really tend to focus in on this when talking about her case. The placing of the scar led investigators to believe that it may well have come from a C-section. It spanned vertically down the length of her abdomen and it was large, 8 inches. Nowadays, surgeons tend to keep C-section scars as small as possible and they're generally horizontal along the bottom of the abdomen. But there's a chance that this woman was pregnant, if she ever was pregnant, at any time from perhaps the 50s all the way through to the 80s. So there's a chance that this C-section scar was done well before the surgical norms of today. And the scar was definitely healed, it wasn't recent. Obviously, never having had a C-section myself, I'm not exactly qualified to give an opinion on whether that truly is what this scar is. There's a thread on Reddit about this case in which people were debating whether or not this scar was too long to be caused by a C-section, and the general consensus is that it wasn't too long, it was probably normal for the time. Although one now deleted user did comment saying, "I showed my doctor her scar to ask her opinion on what it could be. She said it was too high for a C-section scar. In her opinion, it was a bowel resection or something along those lines." Not to take a random stranger's word on the internet as gospel, of course, but the scar could have been something else entirely. Perhaps Jane Doe had a tumour removed or something along those lines, or was involved in an accident at some point. I think C-section is immediately what people's minds jump to though, especially because this links back to how she was found in the baby section of the cemetery. Maybe she did have a child who died and was in that very graveyard, but maybe not. The scar could have been anything else. And she didn't have an autopsy, so we don't know. Perhaps the scar and the graveyard could also explain the Minnie Mouse bum bag, with a lot of people speculating this was a sentimental item which belonged to a child of Jane's, a daughter. I must admit, a lot of the evidence in this case does point to Jane Doe having a child at some point, or a child, or perhaps the loss of a child being the reason behind her actions. Despite Jane Doe's clear wishes to die a Jane Doe, even signing the letters to the coroner and the cemetery under the name Jane Doe, the Virginia police underwent an investigation to find out her identity. It was probably a protocol thing, but I'm not too sure. But even with fingerprints, DNA, clear photos of her face, they hit brick wall after brick wall. Of course, if you've always been a law-abiding citizen, there would be no reason for the police to already have your fingerprints on their system, and DNA tracing only works if there's similar DNA to compare to, and this was the 90s. The reason nobody recognised her face though, I can't be too sure. As the Belgian Jews could suggest, there's a chance she wasn't even from the country, let alone the immediate Virginia area. And as she remains unidentified, it seems that nobody ever reported her as missing either. Was Jane Doe somebody with little family? Was she a recluse? Some online speculate that she was homeless, but her fancy clothes don't quite add up to that. She strikes me as somebody who was very lonely in life and lonely in death. Before Jane Doe was cremated as per her wishes, a complete set of photographs and x-rays would have been taken, which a radiologist would have examined closely for any signs of marks or breaks. Her clothes would have been fully documented as well as the aforementioned finger and palm prints, and a DNA sample would have been taken. A dental exam would have been completed and the dental records would have been entered into the National Crime Information Database. The FBI would have been sent high-resolution photos of her, and if they suspected that she was from another country, the Immigration and Naturalization Service would have been consulted. That's all pretty standard procedure for identifying the unidentified. but I'm not sure if initial investigators did suspect her to be from overseas. But Jane Doe clearly did everything she needed to do for none of this to work. I'm sure back in 1996, Jane Doe's understanding of DNA genealogy testing would have been pretty limited, but still 25 years later and her efforts to remain unidentified are standing strong. The Fairfax police are still asking anyone with information to contact them. But should they? To what duty does the public have to help identify someone who very clearly wished to die a Jane Doe? I honestly can't really tell you which side of the coin I fall on with this. It's a very complex issue with no easy answer. Even if Jane Doe wished to die unidentified, do her loved ones, if any still exist, deserve to know what happened to her? As it seems there were no missing persons reports ever matching her description, it could be easy to assume that she has no living loved ones to look for her, but if that's the case, why would she go to such extreme lengths to hide her identity? Does it even matter if she's identified if no one's looking for her? And how many rights does she have once she's already passed? I know it's a saying about respecting the wishes of the dead, but does that stand up in court? I just think about how sad, how defeated this poor woman must have been to want to leave the world in such a way. Her final moments spent consuming Valium and brandy and securing a bag over her head and listening to comedy tapes, so she went out laughing. What point does somebody have to reach in life to do that? And this clearly wasn't a split-second decision. She thought this through for a long time. This woman went to great lengths to ensure that she went unidentified after her death. She had nothing on her that was even slightly identifiable and had clearly thought through everything, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. I do wonder if she could have maybe purposefully placed some red herrings at the scene to throw off investigators. Maybe she purposefully chose this spot to die so people would try and make some sort of non-existent connection to a lost child. I find myself wondering if maybe Jane Doe was recently widowed, unable to now live without her love and maybe her child also. An idea I kept coming back round to, and this is pure speculation on my behalf, is insurance frauds. I think it's safe to assume that Jane Doe was probably wealthy at some point and by extension so was her family, but what if they'd run into hard times? A lot of life insurance policies pay out big in the event of someone's death, but a lot of policies exclude death by suicide. Maybe to ensure the future of her family, Jane Doe decided to do something drastic and die so her family could get the money. But no one knows who she is, I hear you cry. How on earth would this work? Well, if she disappears completely under strange circumstances, perhaps her life insurance policy would have paid out. If someone disappears, after a few years they can be declared as legally dead and then the family would get a payout. There's a lot of kinks in this theory, of course. I mean, if her family's money situation was that dire, they probably couldn't afford to wait a few years for a payout. But it could explain why there was no missing persons report ever filed if her family were in on the plan, and why she went to such great lengths not to be identified. But then again, if she wanted to do this, why not just walk into a national park and go missing there and likely not be found at all, ever? As I'm saying this theory out loud, I realise that maybe it's not as good as I originally thought, but it could be something to consider. Then there's the DNR bracelet to consider, which is a medical bracelet which is a signal to authorities not to resuscitate in the event of a cardiac arrest or something similar. This isn't something most people have, and generally it's only something you would get if you are older and wish not to be resuscitated, or maybe if you have a terminal illness. With Jane Doe's age being between 50 and 70, the former to me seems unlikely, although admittedly not impossible. But a terminal illness could explain a lot. It could explain why she didn't want an autopsy. It could explain why she wanted to die on her own terms. Perhaps this could even link back to the insurance fraud possibility I mentioned just a second ago, in terms of why she wanted to remain a Jane Doe so badly. I think it's understandable if Jane Doe was terminally ill. Perhaps she'd had long enough to get a medical bracelet made, and it does look fairly worn to me in the photo, and maybe she just reached her limit, waiting too long for the inevitable. But then again, death is inevitable for all of us. Although nowadays anyone can go online and buy some form of a DNR bracelet, according to a Reddit thread which I'll link down below and post by user kid775, valid DNR bracelets, the kind that authorities legally have to honour, are ones that you sign up for. In Virginia specifically, and this is assuming that she was from the state she died in, there are only 2 vendors from which you can buy valid DNR/no-code bracelets. Although the Reddit post was dated 6 years ago and Jane Doe died in 1996, so it is a bit murky. But if the bracelet she wore was a valid one, she would have had to sign up to buy it, presumably stating her reasoning, aka terminal illness. If the bracelet wasn't a legally valid one, and let's face it, any of us could go and buy one right now, then perhaps she was just hopeful that her wishes would still be honoured. Maybe Jane Doe had been hoping to die for a long time and was doing what she could to ensure that she would if the opportunity arose, for lack of a better phrase there. But again, we come back around to this. Where does this make Jane Doe stand in regards to her request for anonymity? Many argue that just because she chose to die herself, or so it seems, it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any investigation at all. What if this actually was the work of a mastermind criminal? What if it was a really well-disguised murder? I mean, it's not impossible, is it? This could have been done by the type of meticulous killer that you see in movies. It could be that somebody wanted Jane Doe dead and concocted a plan. Maybe knowing that she was a drinker and took Valium, they staged the scene, placing the bag over her head, typing the notes themselves and placing her body where it was found, in a conspicuous enough place that people would speculate endlessly. I couldn't tell you the motive behind such murder without her identity, but it could have been anything, couldn't it? It could have been a husband, a neighbour, a child. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that this is the case, that she was murdered and the police didn't investigate the death and look into her identity because there was a note. Well, that looks pretty bad, doesn't it? If it came out years later that this is what happened and the authorities just brushed off the death, they would face a lot of anger, and understandably so. Can you really just take a note like that at its word without knowing who this woman was, her past, her motivation she may have had to commit suicide? All you've got here is a crime scene that looks very much like a suicide, but there's no way of knowing for sure. If you put it like that, you'd want investigators to do everything they could to find her identity. The majority of the time when somebody does to commit suicide and leave a note, you know who they are, you know their motivations behind it a lot of the time, not all of the time, and you can sort of put 2 and 2 together that way. But without knowing Jane Doe's identity, you don't know the reasoning behind it, and that leaves things open to interpretation. Or there's the obvious, what if Jane Doe was a criminal herself? What if she chose to die in the way she did as she was running from the law and couldn't do it anymore? What if the authorities spent the last 25 years searching for a woman who's really been nameless in their databases the entire time? There's no proof that's actually the case here, obviously, but there's no proof that it isn't the case. But now that the woman is dead, would that even matter anymore? Does it matter if she's a criminal? She's gone. What harm does it do to just respect her wishes and not search endlessly for her identity? For all of those reasons, I'm not going to do my usual call to action at the end of this video. I'm not going to tell you to share the video or pay extra close attention to her story. But Annandale Jane Doe is all over the internet. Her case is really picking up in coverage recently. I'm sure because of the added mystery that her request contributes to the story. Everything that she did to ensure she died the way she wanted, to ensure that she remained unidentified, is ironically probably going to be the exact thing that does get her identified in the end. Either that or genetic genealogy, of course. I couldn't really find much reference online to genetic genealogy being done in Annandale Jane Doe's case. All I could find was a post on DNA Doe Project's Facebook page from March 2018, which said that she had already been suggested as a candidate for the project but she was just one name in a long list of those. It states that some of the names on this list were already on their radar, a few were already in contact with agencies, but they can't promise to take on any particular cases, and they make no guarantees of solving them even if they do take them on. So whilst Annandale Jane Doe's name is on the list, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to do it. I feel like this might be the line for me. Actively doing genetic testing for a Jane Doe that has requested no identification might be a step too far. But if she just so happens to be identified via her photo being seen by somebody who knew her, and there must have been people who knew her, then that feels okay to me. She thought through every aspect of her death. She likely knew that she was going to be found within hours, and she would have known that post-mortem photos would be taken. She likely didn't know that in the years to come, her DNA would be put in databases to be connected to long-lost family members, perhaps family that she actively removed herself from. But I don't think there's any right answer in this case. With genetic testing being such a recent development in the world of Doe identification, there are certainly a lot of ethical and moral questions to be ironed out with the concept as a whole. But the intent behind every identification is good at the moment, and I think that's what matters most. I can't wait to hear discussion about this in the comments. What do you think? Should Annandale Jane Doe just be forgotten and remain nameless forevermore? Or is it time that people got answers, both the public and any remaining loved ones? Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.